Marc is a master gardener and has been with us for over 20 years as a master gardener. He's an ethnobiologist, and one of the steering committee goals this year is to start exploring how master gardeners can help our diverse community and the underserved. And Marc will explore, the contributions of African Americans to the farm and garden and herbal traditions here in the United States and what they've brought with them from Africa. So I'm going to let you get started, Marc. Thank you.
Thank you. And I am so glad to be here. I would say of the many different ways that I work on educating the public, this is, at least currently, I think the nearest and dearest to my heart. And even though this is a presentation that I have been working on for years and have delivered in different formats a few times, like a lot of things, it's still a work in progress. I would say that my goal is to take this on the road within the community at a certain point. Although at its current state, I would say that it is not really directed exactly at that, like the public at large. It's really for you as an audience specifically. And I will say that I can imagine that this presentation is going to bring some discomfort to some, if not everybody. And I just want to encourage you to lean in and embrace that discomfort. So many things that are really worth being in life are on the other side of such discomfort. Also, just kind of thinking that if what I'm sharing with you makes you uncomfortable listening to it, imagine what that felt like for people that lived it. So my background a little bit, I am the son of a Black man born in Alabama in 1938. And I am the product of very intense physical and mental abuse from said man for lots of different reasons. Part of that stemming back to the brutality of slavery, I would say. And at the same time, I think that often when people think of like the Black community, they often lead with the idea about the pain inflicted within that community, on that community. And they really don't like get the full holistic picture of Black excellence and Black joy. And there can even be a fetishizing of like Blacks is only their pain and their disadvantages. So I do want to balance that because my dad, he got to the rank of E9 in the Air Force, Chief Master Sergeant. Only 1% of all people that ever enlist in the Air Force receive that rank of any color, any race, any creed. But having been born in Alabama in 1938, he went to the Air Force at 17. He was, an agricultural laborer previous to that, as well as lots of other jobs previous to that. I will say that there's this kind of movement in our family, and I could say also within the community more at large, to move away from such things as getting your hands dirty in agricultural labor. I was definitely raised to be an officer in the military, to be white collar. And this is something that writ large has led to the erosion of a lot of traditions, and also the need for a lot of healing, both physical and metaphysical. I have a bunch of siblings, my mom's only child, and my mom is Dutch. She lives in Europe. There's a kind of twist with that in that the Dutch were some of the largest slave traders of Black people to the Americas. So there's a lot of, shall we say, ancestral trauma bound up within me that's trying to resolve itself slowly, but hopefully surely. Also, my dad remarried the 5th time, I think it was, that we know of at least, to a Jamaican lady who's currently married to, and she's really informed my understanding of the African-American experience from a Caribbean perspective. And so these pictures are me and my dad at his 70th birthday, my siblings and I at her 60th birthday, and my dad with his wife, now Grace, and her mom, who's actually 95 years old. And they live together down in South Florida, Fort Myers. Short of the long of it, I have this incredible privilege in my life in so many different ways, and one being that my mom is European and lives in Europe. I'm actually going there in less than a month. But that privilege is pierced by the pain of my dad kidnapping me when I was a year and a half, and me not seeing her till I was 13, and me only seeing her for a few years of my life total, now at 46. And these are the kinds of things that we're dealing with in these kinds of communities. So I was basically raised by a Black man to pass for white in our society, where that can be a matter of life or death. And that can cause some real fraught energetics, shall we say. Okay. Now, can you all see diversity, inclusion, and racism?
Yes.
Yep.
Excellent. So we're speaking to ancestral trauma, and that leads into things like epigenetics. Of course, there was this time, not even that long ago, that it was thought that basically organisms could not inherit changes that happened from, gosh, epigenetics is a whole big thing to unpack basically, but basically trauma can change the DNA within a lifetime that then can be passed on to the progenitors, the people that come after that trauma. Okay. And that's kind of like a new understanding. There's this idea of cultural appropriation, how this plays out in the Black community. Can be things like using Black art, representing Black things in ways that the Black community might not get through, the internet, memes, these types of things. Here I have more of something around indigenous pushback on cultural appropriation, like taking their sacred plants and taking their sacred actions and using them out of context. Of course, people are always picking up on other things from other people. That's what we do. I really tend to more align as time goes on with the idea of misappropriation versus just appropriation, but cultural appropriation is the term of art, as it were. So it's like, how do we do this ethically? How do we learn and get inspired from other folks and pick up their traditions, but like still honor where those traditions came from? Just to point out, as some, maybe all of you, would be nice, are aware, things like our recent scourge of COVID-19 has really affected people of color disproportionately to other folks. Another thing that's probably harder to be aware of, but maybe any of y'all that have done some homework already can kind of at least sense how hard it can be to be a colored face in a mostly white space, such as our Buncombe Master Gardener group. And that there really is some due diligence on your behalf, if you want to make people like that comfortable in those spaces. Thinking about things like microaggressions, for instance, and trying to avoid them. There's this idea of folk taxonomy and scientific naming. I'm as sciencey as science can get, or as sciencey as I can possibly get. And I know thousands of different scientific names and terms and whatnot. And at the same time, there is kind of like, well, there's science, and then there's like the folk thing. And for me, having been to 30 countries in all 50 states, I'm here to tell you that folk ways of classification are amazing in their own way. They're their own form of science. It's a false dichotomy. And yet, of course, there's common name confusion, and very different things could be called the same thing. We'll get into some examples of that. So I guess I would say it's not either or, but both have their place and both have their challenges. Of course, a lot of scientific names are racist, basically. Call a spade, and a lot of those are getting pushback now, and even public places and the national park system and whatnot similarly. There's this intersectionality that I'd like to very much put out. Sometimes we kind of like put things, kind of look at like them in isolation basically. So I would say on the lowest end of where this kind of meets the road is if you were a transsexual Black person, that's going to be often a much harder road to hoe than if you were a Black man, which is going to be a much harder road to hoe if you are even a white woman, let alone, of course, at the top of the current system are the white men, right? So it's kind of compounded when you have not just race, but you have sexuality, or you have like a racial thing or a religious thing that might be discriminated against. That can just make it like so heavy that it's all you can do to just stay alive in this society in this day. Now, there's this might feel like subtle difference, but it's actually rather big. This idea of being not racist versus anti-racist. Not racist is passive and complicit sometimes with the bad things that happen to people of color in our society. Anti-racist is actively pushing against these things and dismantling the structures that enable them. There's this idea, and this is really big for gardeners, and I hear it all the time. I mean, this would be like a not so microaggression, this idea of, well, I was taught to see no color, right? And well, for one, that's just not true, right? Unless you're literally color. So not helpful just to begin with, but even to think of it conceptually as a goal, imagine a garden with no color. Right? This is not the goal, right? We want color, we want diversity, we want to celebrate diversity. We don't want it to be monolithic and all the same, okay? So don't say that if you do, or you think that, especially to people of color. Okay. And then lastly, there's this idea of then, okay, well, these problems are so big and what can I do? And now I need to go be the savior, right? And then get accolades for it, you know, and pats on the back and, you know, shout it from the mountaintops how good I am. It certainly has its place. You would be in the relative few of our society to take on this work at all. So I'm not discounting that. But at the same time, it's kind of taking some of the oxygen from the room and the energy towards the work itself to put the attention on yourself for doing the work. And I want to say this is a case in point, what I'm sharing with you. This is real talk, y'all, and I know it's not easy. But like this idea that we're seeing in the school systems that like nobody needs to be discomforted because this is reality, is this idea of white fragility that we really have to transcend or even go to start like the base level of this important work that is so up for society right now. Got a great white ally here, my friend Molly Meehan Brown, with some other great teachers of mine down at a conference in Costa Rica. I think these people are just excellent examples. Sabande Greer on the right, and gosh, unfortunately, I'm not remembering the name of the lady in the middle with so much coursing through my mind and my body right now, but Alda Cook is her name actually. Thank you, Lord. Moving on, let's get back to the original place. Of course, we all come from Africa. We're all really Africans, okay? Like hopefully you found that memo. Tens of thousands of years ago, we evolved out of there, then we spread all over the world. But this is the home of us all, not just African Americans. They are traditionally characterized, shall we say. So amazing traditions out there. A lot of people don't even think necessarily of Egypt as Africa. A lot of people think of Africa as a state, as some kind of monolithic thing. There are 50 plus countries and all very different, but some of the really rich traditions that some people are aware of come from Egypt, which is real close to the Middle East and thereby Europe. And yeah, way back, 1500 BC, there's this papyrus that had 700 herbal remedies. And this is what informed a lot of the white herbalists that people are familiar with, like Hippocrates and Galen and Dioscorides. Distillation first mastered, at least to some degree, in Egypt, Alexandria, by Prophetissima in over 2,000 years ago. An amazing drawing in the Temple of Luxor that shows this connection of appropriation from the Indian perspective of Ayurveda and the Chinese perspective of TCM, things like meridians and what is applied now to acupuncture. So this stuff has been in a melting pot for a really long time. Ethiopia, maybe some people are familiar, but everybody needs to know, is the home of coffee. And also along with Somalia, frankincense and myrrh, as well as some of the most incredible food I've ever personally had in my life, like injera. South Africa being super special, it's its own floristic province. So many things, many thousands of things only grow there. For reference, all of North America has about 20,000, 25,000 species of plants. So this small part of Africa has thousands more than that. West Africa is where most of the slaves came from. Two big traditions coming out of there that have gone along with the diaspora. This is the spreading of Black people throughout the Americas and other places through the process of slavery. These traditions, Iwe, from the Iwe of Benin and Togo, has led to Afa and Vodun, or voodoo, as people may be familiar with, and tends to follow in the French-speaking places of things like Haiti or Haiti, as it's probably more properly pronounced, and in places like New Orleans in Louisiana. And then you have the Yoruba, the Ifa, being the spiritual practice, the Orishas being, say, the gods. You could think of it in kind of analogous way to like the Greek and the Roman gods, Mars and Jupiter and these types of things. Like they have their whole own system, basically. One of the kind of patron gods of the gardeners and the herbalists. And then Candomblé and Bria are some other kind of offshoots of Ifa in places like the Caribbean and in America. So then North America, more specific, meeting together is hoodoo, which might be confused with voodoo because it sounds similar, but it's actually different. And we're going to talk more about this here shortly, but there's stuff like mojo working and root work that go into that. So lots of incredible traditions out of Africa, incredible amounts of literature that go along with that. Unfortunately, a lot of that literature is really, really expensive, like $100 to $100+ per book. One of my greatest teachers is a man named Frank Cook, who's pictured here on the bottom right with the welwitschia, which is a really unusual kind of missing link plant that grows in Namibia. He wrote his master's thesis on the emerging planetary medicines, basically like what's going to be our worldwide collection of medicinal plants with globalization. And one of his findings was that the African traditions of herbalism are some of the least known and understood from around the world. We're moving on to remedies. Can people see the remedies slide?
Yes.
Okay. So this is really up and coming. You're seeing a lot of this in the health and beauty sections of the grocery store now. These incredible oils that come from plants in Africa. I think the biggest thing I would say about this is that like a lot of agriculture, there is sustainable agriculture and there is unsustainable agriculture. So trying to focus on the acquiring of these things, should you be interested, from sustainable sources would be really helpful. On the bottom right there, you see me with a baobab tree. That's one of the biggest trees in the world by width. This is actually in Hollywood, Florida, about half an hour from where I grew up, but definitely an iconic tree of the African continent. And then you have above that mango, which a lot of people know for the fruit, but also is used for the oil, as well as lots of other things. Of course, these are more tropical things that aren't going to grow in Western North Carolina, but you can still purchase them here at the grocery store. And so that bears being aware of. So talk about the process of slavery. This happened for about 350 years. There are 11 million people that made it over, and of course, many that didn't. Not of course, but sadly, many that didn't. And it's interesting to note that approximately 1 million of those 11 million made it to the USA. So, order of magnitude more to places like the Caribbean and Central and South America. The folks that were enslaved come from a multitude of groups, a ton of them. And so I have them listed here as some of the main known groups that suffered from that practice. There are a number of different places where the enslaved were taken from, and most of this is going to be in the northwestern corner of Africa, like the Ivory Coast and the Gold Coast, and what was actually called the Slave Coast, and still is in some maps. And this is an outside influence, as I alluded to earlier, on the traditions of the African diaspora to this day. And this isn't like a history lesson. I have friends, that are living, that are my age, that practice these traditions in North America and other places, just to be clear. And so then you had the rice coast and the grain coast as well, that was north of there. And then you had south, very far south of there, Angola and Congo. And that was mostly the dominion of the Portuguese. So these places were kind of like parsed out among the different European colonist powers, including at times American people, but mostly the Dutch and the French and the Portuguese, with some British and Danish as well, kind of like carving out their different spots along this area. So slavery in the role of plant introduction is pretty fascinating. There are Asian and American crops that are staples in Africa through this process, like corn and cassava, for instance, are huge in Africa. So much so, I mean, they've been there for centuries. People can't even believe they, for instance, I've heard it said. Of course, colonization on plantations, there was a huge amount of African intellectual property that went into that because the Europeans were from cold places. They didn't know much about the tropics and how to be successful in the cultivation of things therein, let alone how to stay alive from the diseases that were so much more rampant there. And the food, of course, well, I'm trying to edit that out, but of my speak, but the food was necessary to keep the people alive. So a lot of the food came from Africa with the enslaved people and then was thereby transplanted into the tropical areas of the world where it was suitable, both intentionally, but also sometimes surreptitiously. There's a very famous idea in this day and age of once the slave trade was in full swing and people knew that this could be a reality in their lives. There are some amazing strategies of, say, braiding the seeds of things into the hair so that you could at least have a taste of the homeland and some of the essential connection therein. This book, In the Shadow of Slavery by Judith Carney, is an incredible treatise on this. She's a PhD who's done a lot of work in this space. So thinking about uncompensated and undercompensated Black intellectual property, you have things like farming in the tropics, as I said, that most of the European people would have been lost without the knowledge of the Black folks. And I'll certainly do a shout out for the indigenous people and their knowledge that then often would blend together with the Black folks too, but we're focusing on African Americans here. But specific examples would be the whole pecan industry, right? Before this person who only has one name because he was enslaved on a plantation called Oak Alley in Louisiana, and often folks didn't have a second name in that circumstance. He is responsible for being the first person to graft pecans or pecans. It's interesting, I have such a deep connection to this particular crop because my dad's dad, Papa JT, had an amazing pecan tree in his yard that is one of my best memories of him from when I was a child visiting them in Lynette, Alabama. So before that, people were just planting seeds, letting seedlings grow up, and the quality was very mixed. And there was no way to make it a commercial industry until Antoine figured out this idea of grafting improved cultivars onto seedlings. Similarly, you have smallpox, an enslaved person named Onesimus who taught a white person named Cotton Mather about this idea of inoculation and basically a type of vaccination that is often not, appreciated or credited. Another huge one, multi-billion-dollar industry of vanilla. Vanilla comes from Mexico. Most of it now comes from Madagascar and other places abroad. But before, once again, another enslaved person, Edmund Albius, figured out the way to hand pollinate the vanilla. There was no way to produce it commercially anywhere other than in Mexico. And he died poor, even though he founded that whole industry. Lastly, just to say, closer to us here, you have Nathan Nearest Green, who was the teacher of Jack Daniels how to make whiskey, right? And this is something that is more recently understood. This is actually his son, George Green, with Jack Daniels in a picture. And now there's actually a nearest green whiskey and Black people reclaiming that technology for themselves with Black-owned business, which is a good thing. And lastly, I have this picture that looks like, from way back in the day. This is the only man who had a scientific name placed after him from the great Swedish botanist Linnaeus in the 1700s. And oh my gosh, just so much, so much, so much, so much, so much, so much, so much coursing through. But anyway, he saved a whole bunch of people in South America with trademark plant Quassia amara. His name was Quassia. And this is something that's used to this day in bitters, for instance, and also to be health supportive in tropical places.
Mark, can you advance the screen because we can't see the bottom of it, or at least I can't see it below vanilla pollination.
Yeah, I think that's just how it's projected or something. It's
Okay.
not about advancing, but I am going to advance the screen. Anyway, we're moving on. So there's lots of cultures that were introduced from Africa to the Americas, all right? And you might be familiar with some of these. Once again, some of them are picking up a lot in trade. I've already mentioned some like the baobab and the coffee and the mango. Moringa is a really big one because of its nutrition, both in the leaves and in other parts of the plant, as well as potential medicinal applications. A big thing also is this tradition of some of the best conservation areas in Africa. And also colleague Alison Ormsby at UNCA does research all over the world on this, of religious groups being the holders of some of the best conservation areas because of the designation of those areas as being sacred. And this is certainly something, yeah, like I said, you see with lots of other groups too. So thinking about beyond trees, there are other things that were introduced from Africa that are herbaceous that oftentimes are somewhat synonymous with African American culture and tradition. Say like with New Year's, you're going to have your black-eyed peas and your greens, right? But lots of other things besides black-eyed peas and greens, and okra is another example, and watermelon is another example. A big one being sorrel, that's kind of on the up and up, but that's the red. It's in red zinger tea from Celestial Seasonings, for instance. Also called Jamaica in Latin American places, and then called sorrel in Jamaica or Jamaica. Sorghum being one of these, and millet being actually a kind of sorghum at times. Millet's kind of a common name for a bunch of different kinds of crops. These are some of the best crops in the world for arid and desert-like environments, which unfortunately with climate change is going to be much more of a circumstance moving forward that we're going to need to adapt to. There are kinds of rice that are from Africa, so rice is not just Asian, just to be clear. Sesame being another thing also that everybody will be familiar with. And then there's maybe some, even hyacinth bean. I was tickled to learn of that purple viney bean that sometimes is grown ornamentally here in the Western North Carolina region as an annual, also comes from Africa. It is also, although people don't always know that. And in total, you got over 100 species. So thinking about slavery and plantation medicine, this idea of, in particular, Black women taking care of everybody, whether they be Black, white, or anything in between, from childcare to death, historically in the South. Then their knowledge being discredited with the rush to modernization for things like hospital births, for instance, versus having a midwife. There's a reclaiming of that happening now, and that's not to say that there is, I'm wanting to be clear. I mean, obviously the hospital has its place for a lot of things, and birth could be one of them. But giving credit where credit's due, it's interesting. I mean, there is Dr. John Wilson, I think his garden that's dedicated to him came up earlier in our discussion before this started. And I had 20 some years ago as a student at Warren Wilson of him like delivering, most of the kids born in Black Mountain. And then maybe a month ago learned of a Black lady who unfortunately I can't remember at the time in this moment, delivering tons of kids as well, including not just Black people, mountain community as well. So it's just really this thing. And it gets into this idea even of Appalachia, this like white monolith, and regarding the rich Black tradition in Appalachia that's always been here, and free people even during the times of slavery, for instance. Incredible stories that are now just getting unearthed. But I would say one big one that everybody needs to be aware of is that the banjo comes from Africa. Okay, so if you're not familiar, that's a pro tip right there. What would Appalachia be without the banjo? And that's a plant thing, and it was originally a gourd, and then it moved to like a pie tin. So we've got a lot of credit there to the culture, right? Thinking about unethical experimentation and then how this plays out in the Black community when you talk about the uptake of, say, a vaccine that modern science says is the best thing. And I will say I've been vaccinated and boosted, and I don't know that this is like a fraught thing in our society, no matter who you might be or what population you might be part of. But speaking specifically to the Black experience, there have been terrible, horrible things done to Black people in the name of science. And a lot of people know about the Tuskegee experiments with syphilis. My dad was actually born not much more than an hour from there. But maybe fewer people know about Henrietta Lacks and the use of her cells in cancer research that is a multi-billion-dollar generating type of thing. Family did not benefit. There was no informed consent in doing that. And now there's a movie about it, and Oprah's kind of made it much more famous. But this is something, once again, just recent. Less people would be familiar with J. Marion Sims, although he's like, held up as like the kind of father of gynecology and the horrible experiments he did on Black women to perfect his techniques. And then this is something that like is just, for me, just so tangible and visceral. This idea of sterilization, people seem to be unfit, including myself, right? Being a mulatto, born to a Black and white person, that is something that would be, not even that long ago, 100 years ago in the US, grounds for sterilization, potentially to eliminate the pollution of the gene pool. Okay. So also Latino people, huge amounts of this that happened in Puerto Rico specifically. These are the traumas that people of color face when they are told that modern medicine wants to help them. Okay. So going a little bit more into the particular traditions in North America, there's the conjure, the hoodoo, the mojo working, the root work. And just to be clear, this is not a religion. It's a syncretic tradition of African beliefs, European beliefs, Middle Eastern beliefs. And it gets into this idea of future telling and using magic, and in particular, trying to make good things happen in your life or make bad things happen to your enemies. And there is certainly also idea of ancestor connection, which of course plays out in a number of other societies as well. And so you have spells, you have talismans that you might carry, mojo bags being an example of that. And, some person, white blues person playing the blues, talking about his mojo being an example of appropriation, right? Especially if he doesn't know what that really means, other than it like sounds good and makes him feel good. So there's all of this interesting tradition that goes into that, herbs and stones and other ingredients, and how many of them, and consecrating them with these smokes and oils and all sorts of special plants that are used in this process. There's also this very fascinating connection between the African American community and the Judaism and Jewish community of the South, in particular, as two marginalized groups. It's kind of like binding together for survival has been a big thing historically, and to a certain degree to this day. There's all of these elements that go into things like gardening that are psychospiritual, emotional, like thinking about literally elemental forces like the air, the fire, the earth, collecting earth from special places like grave sites, like outside of the police office or outside of an old plantation or whatever it might be, that might be kind of thought of now as like woo-woo, or what does it have in basis of reality or scientific whatever. But these are things that people believe, and they shouldn't be discounted out of hand just because they don't fit into some rubric that we can kind of readily understand. And it makes me think of a quote that's attributed to Einstein that really gets into this, I think, fallacy sometimes of scientific thinking. And the quote is that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. Okay. So voodoo, very different. This is a religion. This has a much different kind of context than hoodoo. And I've already mentioned that this tends to be more outside of the country and French-speaking places with the voodoo than as much here, other than in places like New Orleans or within people from the Louisiana diaspora. Of course, after the big hurricanes that have been down there, there's a lot of people that have had to go to other places just here of that space. So particular cultural groups within North America, you've got this Afro-Indigenous thing that's really fascinating. Just about every Black friend that I know has a story about the grandmother or the great-great-grandmother or the great-great-grandmother that was Indigenous and had the long black hair. So a lot of blending there. Once again, two marginalized groups banding together in order to survive, in particular with the indigenous groups of Florida that are still extant, the Seminole and the Miccosukee. They actually originally came from much further north, like in Alabama and Georgia, were part of the Creek Confederacy and kind of an amalgamation of the Creek and the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and the Cherokee. So coming out of the end of slavery and then Reconstruction and then into Jim Crow, at a certain point, also within my very family, there is this idea of we got to get the hell out of the South and go somewhere that's better. So this caused this diaspora called the Great Migration, wherein millions of people traveled up north, in my case, to Ohio and Michigan to work in the car factories and other industrial places, but certainly the coal mines of West Virginia and Kentucky would be another example. And then even as far out as California in some cases. And there are different places that are celebrating these traditions I'm sharing in California, like the Hoodoo Heritage Festival and Healing Waters retreats that are based out of Nashville, the NOLA Herb Gathering in New Orleans, and then the Gullah Geechee having a fascinating tradition all their own and having their whole own gathering. And also some of the best documentation of African American traditions in North America comes out of the Sea Islands and these Gullah Geechee traditions. Some of the best books being The Folk Remedies of the Low Country by Julia Morton and Hoodoo Medicine from Faith Mitchell. Lots of herbalists that are both up and coming and extant, and some that have passed a fewer books representing for these people, but Leaves of Green by Maud Scott, who I was lucky, or Maud Green, who I was lucky to spend time with in Florida. I was a young man before she passed, and The Folk Wisdom and Mother Wit by John Lee are some really incredible examples of these traditions. And John was from the Piedmonts and not that far from here, and probably more germane to here. All these other amazing people are here. They're doing it now in different parts of the country, from New England to the Southeast, Northwest, and the Southwest. I will say that I have a series of articles through the Chestnut School of Herbal Medicine that details a lot of what I'm sharing with you and has lots of links to the websites of people like this. Should that be of interest, you could Google me and African American Traditions, Chestnut School of Herbal Medicine. And okay, thanks for there's a tip in the chat about bourbon lovers and a good source to enjoy this type of thing yourself. So within the tradition of African American healing, just like a lot of traditions, there's a mixed bag of practices, a lot of things plant-wise that are known now, if not previously, to be toxic. If previously known to be toxic, then oftentimes method of preparation, part used, how much used, in what way, and contraindications being very important to apply these safely and sustainably. One source lists 163 home remedies. That's this African American Home Remedies Practical Guide by Eddie Boyd. And beyond plants, lots of other things in there that could potentially be toxic, like kerosene and mercury and the use of healing. And this can often lead to being like, okay, well, that was backwards and that was not right. And so now I need to go to the hospital because that's what's right and that's what's modern. But I would argue is kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? That there's just, yeah, often this rush to say, well, if some of it's bad, then it's all bad, in a lot of cases. This one just being one example. There's a pretty extensive book by a man named William Green or Grime, I'm not sure, or Grime, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but it's the Afrobotany of the Black Americans. And it's still probably the most exhaustive source of information on this type of subject matter. Okay, now my slides are not wanting to advance. Gotta be kidding me. Okay, now it's advancing. All right, so some North American plants that are used. Dr. Francis Porcher back in the Civil War times documented 600 species used in the South. You can, I think, find his book as a PDF now, like the resources of the Southern fields and forests. Within, I've extracted some of the major ones in the African American tradition, like castorine and cotton, mullein, peach, and pomegranate. A lot of other plants that people may recognize that grow in this area, like black walnut and blackberry and cudweed and devil's walking stick and dogwood and eastern red cedar, hollies, pine, sassafras, sumac, sweet gum, wild black cherry, and wax myrtle, and yellow dock, right? These are all things that grow here. And we could have an African American garden as part of our demonstration garden where we're growing these things to then bring Black people to celebrate their traditions as part of the rich tapestry of the heritage of this area and many other areas within the country. Specific within that, there being a tradition, like many groups, of making alcohol. And some of these are kind of like, kind of standard, no big surprise, blackberry and cherries and elderberries and grapes and persimmons, but black gum being a real outlier that I haven't really seen attributed to any other group as of yet. I happen to make a lot of alcohol myself in that tradition. I have a palette of around 250 species of plants and fungi that I've worked with over the last 20 years. And we have this incredible garden, the George Washington Edible Park, downtown Nashville, dedicated to, of course, one of the more famous of the African American agricultural researchers, the Tuskegee Institute. Holding here some persimmons to honor him. So some folks are familiar with battle trees, I imagine, if not everybody at this point. They're kind of pretty chic and pretty, popular. This is something that did come out of Africa, although sounds like originally attributed to Arabic traders from the Middle East. And both fashion, but also a function, right? I think we're all familiar with this idea of the genie in the bottle, for instance, the capturing of a spirit within a container. In this case, a benevolent spirit that can give you wishes, but in the case of the bottle trees, really forming a function of capturing bad spirits so that they can't hurt you. Interestingly, the big tradition historically, although it's really branched out in this amazing book that's not that big and not that expensive by Felder Rushing, really takes a deep dive into this idea of glass art in the garden and how diverse it is now. But historically, using blue as a color, although cobalt blue is attributed to a silver mining area of Germany originally. That's where that term comes from. And so just kind of speaks to the melting pot that we are all heir to. Just speaking a little bit to the stories of the sadness from the field, and once again, like, why don't Black people want to go into the garden? Well, you have things like bananas. It was fascinating to me when I went to Costa Rica and I was on the Caribbean coast and I saw all these Black people that were speaking Spanish and had their own herbal tradition. Originally, I thought if I were to ever get a PhD, this would be it, is studying these Black people, studying actually the quite large extant indigenous population there, the Latino population there, and then all of the white folks and Latino Ticos and Ticas, as they call themselves, the natives of Costa Rica, and how their plant traditions have melded together. But sure, the longa that Jamaicans were brought to work the bananas about a century ago to Costa Rica and also build the railroad to transport them. And bananas are a hard road to hoe. God, if it's not organic and fair trade, then you can bet that there is suffering behind that peel. Okay, basically, in a lot of different ways, from spraying while the workers are in the field from airplanes to all sorts of other things. Chocolate is probably the worst. Like literally most of the commercial, non-organic, non-fair trade chocolate that is going into the commercial trade of the big corporations now, a lot of it is picked by child labor, little Black people that are basically still in slave-like conditions to this very day. Coffee, once again, very hard, typically not maybe quite as hard as something like chocolate or bananas for various different reasons, but it's still a very hard thing to do. And also very much held hostage to the vagaries of global production, volatility in prices, and then climate change is really affecting a lot of these things. And then sugarcane, oh my God, the Black people that are, say, working in the Dominican Republic, the Haitian immigrants. There's an incredible podcast from NPR on the show called Reveal that tells the story of the Black people doing the sugarcane in the Dominican Republic to this very day and the horrible conditions that they have to face within that. Okay, so this is all stuff that's obviously at the grocery store. These are some of the biggest things of global trade. And this is the sadness that's behind the face of those low cost prices for that low quality product that is not organic or fair trade. Coming to Easter right around the corner makes it all the more relevant, to say, in regards to chocolate. But you could extend that to Halloween, you can extend that to Valentine's and lots of other things too. That you're trying to have a good vibe, but it's based on suffering, okay? Moving on to the Afro-Caribbean thing just for a second. Obviously, we're up in the mountains and unfortunately far away from a lot of the things that would grow in these places, but now people are growing ginger and turmeric and even some bananas and other things as annuals and chayote. And just to say that in Jamaica specifically, there's a lot of research, but in lots of other places too that I could share should people be interested. There is probably the most famous conceptual framework of the Maroons, which is actually a Spanish word for escaped slaves that then inhabit spaces autonomously. And the tradition in Jamaica goes back like 400 years. But there is a great book that just came out about the Great Dismal Swamp in North Carolina and the Maroons that inhabited that space as well to bring it closer to home. Big society for all this stuff is a Society for Economic Botany that has an annual conference in different parts of the country or the world, and the one this year happens to be in Jamaica, so I'll be going there in June to presenting on some of the traditions of making beverages there. Oh God, why would the phone ring right now? I mean, this day and this presentation, I don't know, it's almost like cursed a little bit. I'm gonna just stop this real quick. Okay, so we talked about racial demographics earlier. This is a picture of Harriet Tubman from the Burton Street Community Garden, which is amazing. If I've been there, I highly recommend it. It's right near West Asheville and has a really excellent example of on-the-ground African-American gardening traditions. Would be great to do tours there. And as was mentioned before, maybe some people came online, there's a group called Hood Huggers, which is affiliated with this garden that actually does tours of Black Asheville all around the area, places where people traditionally have inhabited spaces from the African-American community. So just real quick, 6.3%, this is from the census last year, 6.3% Black people, okay, and 6.8% Latino people. So just do the math on how many master gardeners are there. And if we were to have a representative sample by percentage, then there needs to be a good bit more Black people and a good bit more Latino people, all right? And then of course there is a smaller percentage of Asian folks and indigenous folks and folks like me, mulattoes, 2 or more races, that it would be great to represent for as well. So I would just throw the gauntlet on how to have these numbers from our county represent our numbers within our Master Gardener group. Speaking to online resources, some of the best stuff I found through Extension is out of Florida from Extension agent named John McLaughlin that has a bunch of, information about the Black traditions in Florida. It would be great to see similar stuff for the ones in Western North Carolina. There's a bunch of schools that are in this space that are educating the public about the African American traditions, especially specifically within herbalism. And then, of course, there are a bunch of Facebook groups as well that are representing for these groups, and even conferences and more in this day and age. I know we're pretty much almost there. These are some of the best books from my personal collection that I found so far to honor the African American tradition in gardening and in farming in North America. And this one specifically in the bottom left, Junaluska, speaks to the Black experience in Appalachia, written by Dr. Sue Keith, who is from my alma mater where I went to grad school at Appalachian State University, and is an expert, I would say, in that space. High on the Hog being a Netflix series for folks that aren't aware. And I definitely would say Farming While Black, if you had to pick one book to really understand this. Out of Soulfire Farm, and an amazing person named Leah Penniman, who actually came here to present for the Organic Growers School a few years ago. That would be the one, if you had to pick one, Farming While Black. All right, well, we had some technical difficulties. We got a little bit of a late start even before that. So I always tend to try to be on time, but I don't feel too bad, 1 minute over. And, of course, we could handle these things offline. I really hope there will be a committee to embrace these things and really bring to fruition some of our best potential to show up for folks like me and those that I talked about in this space through the Master Gardener program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Oh my gosh, do you want to stop sharing your screen and we can come back into video? And yeah,
On the chat.
Hey, I have a question for Mark. Mark, you showed a lot of books, and several of them I think I would be interested in pursuing. And I was wondering if you could make a reading list or just a book list from all
Happy
the
to.
book covers that you showed, and maybe put it on the bulletin board or something like that, because there's several that you went past. I didn't have time to write them down. So
well, really, of course, this is recorded, so you can always visit it in the recording, but I'm happy also to make a list.
Okay, thanks.
And
You're
I'll
welcome.
give a shout out to High on the Hog, and if you want to see it, it's on Netflix and it is excellent.
And I'll give a shout out. It's not just about Burton Street. There's Tempe Avery Gardens, there's the Eddington Center Gardens, there's Pisgah View Gardens. There's a bunch of gardens that are in these communities now. Bountiful Cities is a big nonprofit operating in this space, and they formerly ran this thing called the Urban Agriculture Alliance that did a lot of interviews with community members of these spaces, and also in Emma, more with the Latinidad folks over there. So we don't have to recreate the wheel, y'all. There's a lot of work that's been done already if you're interested in engaging with this. And if you are, please let me know, let Allison know. We talked about how do we really tangibly move this forward. Well, part of it is not trying to pull a horse to water, just too much going on right now to make people do things. But if you want to do these, we want to empower you to help.
I would also say, given a background in healthcare, that if you overlay the community health assessment with this, what the community health assessment measures what people die of, what are the diseases, and it's done by county and it's done every 3 to 5 years. And you look at the causes of death, and you look at how gardening can impact that by bringing fresh food to underserved communities, it is significant. So there's that component too that is of interest to me. Tangentially, it's of interest to me. So
And
I
I
just
would
shared
tag
that.
on that. I mean, there's the phytochemistry and the nutrients and it's pressure and all these things, right? But there's also the psycho-spiritual emotional component, which is just as big with health and well-being. To get back into the garden, to reclaim that legacy that we all come from, and to be in the garden in a place of beauty and power instead of in a place of subjugation.
Mark, I have a question. When people have been bringing up all of these traditions, traditional ways of growing and things they use and all that, how much of this is kind of lost among the current generation? And this has been trying to find, you know, that 80-year-old farmer who did it, da, 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 because there's been so much disruption to the Black community or any other of the
Even
marginalized.
Appalachian white folks,
Tradition's
it's
gone.
been lost, right?
Yeah,
I mean, so imagine like the people, and they were doing it free, you know, like, I mean, no, it's been so lost to the current generation because it was like, get the hell out of the farm, get the hell out of this hard scrabble life. You need to go be a nurse. You need to go be an engineer. You need to go be a lawyer. You know, anybody that comes from nothing, I think in a lot of immigrant communities as well, it's like, no, your goal is to like transcend that. And it's sad because of course, yeah, nobody wants to be slaving or like even, you know, just barely getting by to survive. But then once again, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater of all the gifts that come from gardening and the beauty that is in there if you're doing it in the right way and of your own accord.
Yeah, it almost reminds me of the people who collected folk songs, you know, in the 20s and 30s and 40s before it was all gone and assimilation from radio and TV. We've even lost our unique accents.
And that's what I and my colleagues in the science of ethnobotany, right? Ethno studying ethnic groups, different cultures, botany studying plants. That's what we're racing against time to do right now, right? In the 30 countries I've been to in all 50 states, this is not something that's specific to Black. It is like, go to the city, get a good job, and flourish versus like be in the country and barely get by.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, when those 80-year-old and 90-year-old, I mean, my dad was in part raised by his great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, who was born enslaved and lived to be over 100 years old, right? And was apparently a midwife and all these traditions. And when she went down, it was like a Library of Alexandria for our community and for our particular family. But that's happening every day all around Appalachia right now, whether you're white, Black, Cherokee, Latino, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments for Marc today? You've just given me tons to take in, and I hear it in your voice, and I want to thank you for opening yourself to us and telling your story. Just really touching, and yet, as you know, not just thought-provoking, but I can feel it in my body, like you're saying, right? You know, like this is big stuff, and I'm just honored that you have shared this story with us, Marc. You are a reservoir and a holder and a keeper of so much knowledge that you have gathered, and I know your passion that's coming through you is not only in this lifetime, but your ancestral connections, right? You know,
I pray to them every day at this point to just honor the legacy.
Yeah. Gosh, I'm just so grateful. I have a lot of gratitude for you at this moment for what you've shared with us. And I hope and invite everybody to take this forward and into your lives. And as far as our work as master gardeners, as we scratch the surface of the soil here to see what we might do, you've given some really good opportunities and ideas today for us to consider, you know, through our mission of bringing this out in some way and connecting with the partners that are here in the community, people already doing it, you know. And so one of the things that we've talked to, you know, that I've talked with Sue and Joyce about, bringing this forward is our own learning. Right? Learning and then what I'm hearing today is how do we act into that? You know, how do we move with that? So, and I don't know, I feel like we could sit here all afternoon and get in deeper into some of the small things, you know, and how do we,
Or all lifetime.
yeah, right. Yeah. How do we look at ourselves and things we say and our thoughts and stuff? So much to look at. And
I just want to emphasize, put those thoughts into action, you know, because everybody's doing the DEI thing now, the diversity, equality, and inclusion, and yada, yada, and all the talking points, as Greta Thunberg says, blah, blah, blah. You know, I mean, this is like, it's time to move, you know, not talk. Like, I mean, you got to start with the talking, but then where is the action? In the parlance of permaculture, harvest the yield. I do want to plant one more seed. Incredible Cherokee presenters at the Organic Growers School this past weekend. We need to have them doing this kind of thing. You know, for a while, I was that person, you know, at these different conferences that I go to, and I don't even feel comfortable with that even more. I've been studying their stuff for hundreds of hours, and I maybe even know a good bit more than they do about some of it. But they are doing an amazing job for themselves now. And of course, they're the original people of this land. And folks like Mary Crow and Tyson Sampson and folks that were at the Organic Growers School need to be doing this kind of thing for us and for the community.
great. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. Well,
Thank you so much, y'all, for holding space. Thank you for sticking on well past the time as it was forecast. Thanks for bearing with me through the technological difficulties. And please engage in any way that you feel called or fit moving forward with me, with our group, with Allison in particular. Thank you.
thank you, Mark. All right.
Thank you
Blessings
Thank you
to
so
you.
much.